It's an absolute delight to see so many people here. So thank you for coming out on a cold night, and I hope I will be able to keep your attention for about 25 to 30 minutes. If we need to, we can have a little break in the middle. But I really want to get across some of the issues to do with perfluorinated compounds. First, I'd like to talk about some of the science, some of the health issues, and then I will go on and talk about a little bit about the strategies and the things you need to think about in what is going to be a long haul. My partner John and I have worked with many communities over the years, people like you who are caught up in a contamination issue, and we really do know how hard and difficult it can be. So let's get on. I call my talk Perfluorinated Compounds, Emerging Contaminants or Old Enemies. And the reason I call it that is that for me, we've been working with PFCs, perfluorinated compounds, for probably 20-25 years. It's been a long old haul. When we finish this meeting very soon, we'll be going to Rome to work with the POPs Review Committee to do the next assessment of PFOA, which I'll talk a little bit about in a sec. How I thought I'd do this first part of the talk is to base it on some of the responses that I get when I'm talking to people, when I'm talking to regulators, or I'm talking to media, and some of the things they say back to me. And I thought, you'll recognise some of them. And the first one I so often hear is, why are we worrying? PFOS and PFOA, they're everywhere, they're in consumer products. What's the problem? And the problem is, they are everywhere. And they are still in consumer products here in Australia, because the Australian government has not taken any action to ban or recall them. Other countries have, but we have not. So there's a range of them, and I've just listed a few of them up there, and I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see this from the back, so don't worry if you can't catch what's on the screen. Everything is in our report. We have a June version of our perfluorinated compounds report. It's downloadable from the website. We update it with new information all the time, so just keep an eye on the web page. So we know PFOS and we know PFOA, and of course we're now talking about the PFHXS, and there's PFHXA. There's a whole range of them, and I notice the defence now is talking about the fluorotomer sulfonate, the 625TS. People ask me, well, what is that? What does it stand for? And all it really is a breakdown product of some of the chemicals that are used in the fire retardants. There is a huge group of perfluorinated compounds, hundreds of them. When the European Union nominated PFOS for the Stockholm Convention, they wanted to nominate 96 other chemicals that were related to PFOS. We got around that way, and we've got PFOS and anything that can make PFOS on the convention. And now we're looking at PFOA. There are thousands of them. So yes, these are ubiquitous chemicals. And they have lots and lots of industrial uses. Metal plating is a common use for PFOS, semiconductors, coatings on carpets, materials, tiles, things you'd never think of. And of course, we have firefighting foams. And when it comes to consumer products, the ones that I think most of us would remember, and certainly if you've got grey hair like me, you probably remembered in the 70s getting out your suede coat and spraying the Scotch Guard on it so it would look beautiful and clean and really cute. And unfortunately, that was PFOS. Teflon, made from PFOA. Still get some non-stick made from PFOA, but most of the companies are now using a different form of fluorochemical, but still quite a nasty one. As I said, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which is a UN treaty for the worst of the worst. So for a chemical to get listed on this treaty, you can imagine how serious it is. And as I said, PFOS has been listed with some exemptions to phase out those usages so countries can work their economies and catch up. We got rid of another 6 or 8 of those uses a couple of years ago, and now we're in the process of assessing PFOA. One of the reasons that these chemicals are used so much is because people refer to them as the slipperiest things man ever knew, man ever made, because they repel water and they repel stain. They're a very convenient chemical. So when I mention the Stockholm Convention, this is the next response I get. And I got this from a Canberra bureaucrat just recently. Well, so what? PFOS is on the Stockholm Convention. What does it matter? Well, it matters a lot. Because POPs chemicals, the persistent organic pollutants that are put onto the convention, you'd know some of them, DDT, dieldrin, heptachlor. If there's farmers in the room, you'd remember some of those from the 70s and 80s. POPs have 4 particularly nasty characteristics. They are incredibly persistent, and PFOS and PFOA are the big daddies of all when it comes to persistency. They do not break down. So what is out there in the environment, what we cannot recapture to destroy, will be with us for all time. They're transboundary. They travel by air and water currents and via wildlife when they're exposed to them and are in their bodies. And they're often nicknamed poisons without passports because they recognise no national borders. They go where they like. They move into the air currents on dust or from volatilising or evaporating. They move with the air currents and with the wind. They may get washed out by the rain or they may condense out. And then they heat up again and off they go on their path. And they finally go to the Arctic or the Antarctic. And our colleagues, the Inuits of Canada and Alaska, have some of the most outrageously high levels of these chemicals in their body, yet they've probably never even used them. The other thing about them is they're bioaccumulative. They build up in living things, in you and me and our children and our grandchildren. They're passed from mother to child in utero and through breast milk. And unfortunately, Australian women have higher levels than pregnant women in Germany. So that's a bit of a worry for us here in Australia. And if you look at the way they bioaccumulate or bioconcentrate, that image to the left there at the bottom, I doubt if you can see it, but it's basically showing that once you have these chemicals in the water, they can move into the sediment. Animals and aquatic life can consume bits of them in the sediment. Small fish eat them, bigger fish eat them, and guess who eats the big fish? We do, of course. And of course they are toxic. And we are all exposed to them via water, food, and dust. And I saw some stuff in the Department of Defence papers just recently about how it really didn't matter if the PFOA levels weren't that low in water because somehow they don't bioaccumulate so much in fish. Well, to some degree that's true. These chemicals bioaccumulate to much greater levels in air-breathing animals like us. In fish, they can expel them through the gills. But if we look at dietary assessments, what you and I eat and how much we get through our diet, where we get our largest amount is through lean fish and crustaceans. So they may not bioaccumulate a lot, but they certainly bioaccumulate enough. Now this is my favourite one. I love this one. PFOS and PFOA are emerging contaminants and we don't know much about them. And I'm sorry, my response to that is, which sandpit have you had your head in for the last 50 years? These chemicals have been around for near on 80 years. These are not emerging contaminants. They are not new. The creator of 3M, or the guy that set up the 3M company, created the chemicals that formed these in 1938. By the late 40s and the early 50s, we had Teflon, we had Scotchgard. So those have been around for quite a while. By 1968, they were finding PFOS in human blood. By 1980s, they knew it was in the drinking water of America. And by 1987, the first study that showed PFOS caused cancer in rats was released. sorry, PFOA, oh, I do apologise, PFOA cancer in rats. That was a very famous study, and that's quite a while ago. In 2000, we had a flurry of activity, which Australia was involved in. The OECD, or the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, as you can imagine, that is not a terribly revolutionary or alternative organisation. They assessed PFOS and found it to be of global concern to human health. Now, Australia was part of those discussions, so they knew then, certainly, by 2000, they were fully aware of the problems. The USA banned PFOS in that same year, with some exemptions, and 3M announced the end of PFOS production. Unfortunately, 3M then allowed other companies in other countries to use its production methods, so we saw it being produced in Japan and China. By 2003, our regulatory agency, NICNAS, as you heard, put out a warning to all government and industry: do not use PFOS-based firefighting foams. 2003. That's a while ago, you know, my term, 13 years ago. They warned everyone, do not use them. Who listened? Very, very few. So I won't go right through them, but by 2004 we were finding it in 100% of umbilical cord blood of newborn babies in studies that were done. 2006 we had another flurry of activity when Canada and EU announced bans of PFOS. The US and the European companies announced that they would phase out PFOA by 2015, and they started that. Unfortunately, China and Asia ramped up production. And of course, in 2009, PFOS was listed on the Stockholm Convention. Tragically, Australia has still not ratified that listing. And I have been asking the government since 2009, explain. Why haven't we ratified it? Nearly every other country in the world has ratified it. China's ratified it. Why? Oh, well, we've got to discuss it with our states and we've got to get agreement with our states. Well, this is an international convention. They could ratify it if they want and tell the states to do what they need to do. But they have not. They have chosen not to. I'm not going to say why. I'll leave it to you to work out. So basically, by last year, we started to see cases going against DuPont for PFOA and cancer. A woman won 1.6 million for kidney cancer, and EU nominated last year PFOA to the Stockholm Convention. And some of you probably know that just recently, a gentleman in the States won 5 million from DuPont for testicular cancer. So that's the next response I get. Yes, well, but there's no evidence of harm. Well, I'm sorry, since the 1970s, late 60s, we have been seeing animal study after animal study showing that there are problems. We can't put humans in a room, feed them PFOA and PFOS and see if they drop dead. That's actually sort of somewhat immoral. So we rely on animal tests. But when they come back with bad outcomes, we seem to ignore them. And we certainly have ignored the animal studies that have shown PFOS, reproductive and developmental toxicity, neurotoxicity affecting the way we think and the way our children grow, and thyroid and liver cancer. PFOA, even worse. Liver cancer, kidney cancer, a whole range of things, quite unpleasant. And one of the things that first came to my notice was this increase in obesity in the offspring of exposed dams, or the exposed mother. And this was a case of mice. For those who can see it, it's the middle photo. The mouse on the far right is obviously the obese one, and the mouse on the left is the normal one. And you can see it's quite a dramatic difference. I popped up the photos there of the dolphin because the bottlenose dolphin probably has some of the highest level in the animal kingdom. And the little penguin up there, that's a penguin from the Antarctic, and its eggs are contaminated with PFOS and PFOA. And one of the things that the animal studies showed us clearly is that the developing fetus was one of the most susceptible, sensitive to these forms of toxicity. So what do we get next? We get the Assistant Defence Minister coming out, putting his hand on his heart saying, I can assure you there is no connection between these chemicals and human health. Now, most of us, you could have knocked us over with a feather, because truly, I was just stunned when he said that. I noticed the department then started to use the term, there's no consistent evidence, and I'll deal with that in a second. But these are quotes from the US EPA's health advisories that came out in May this year. For those up the back who can't read it, I'll just quickly run through. Human epidemiology data, population data, report associations between PFOS exposure and high cholesterol, thyroid disease, immune suppression, reproductive and developmental parameters, including reduced fertility. Some human studies suggest an association with bladder, colon, and prostate cancer. For PFOA, they reported association between PFOA exposure, high cholesterol, increased liver enzymes, decreased vaccination response, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced hypertension, preeclampsia, and cancer, testicular and kidney. US EPA. They have been working on the assessment of these chemicals probably for the last 8 years. It's probably one of the most thorough assessments. There's things I disagree in there still, but really it's the best we have got. And if that's what's coming out with them, I would suggest, how dare the Assistant Defence Minister get up and say there is no association. Now, as well as that, we have a range of studies, and I could sit here and quote you studies till the cows came home, but I suggest it's probably easier if you just read our report, because that talks about the individual studies. But one group of studies which I think is so important to it, the ones that are concerning the PFC mixtures, because no one's exposed to just one chemical. We're exposed to a range of perfluorinated compounds. And what we've seen is research showing that at population levels, current population levels, we see endocrine disruption in the upper areas of those population levels, thyroid disease, obesity. And about 2 weeks ago, the National Toxicology Program of the US, one of the most respected toxicology programs in the world, basically a government-funded body, came out with a report showing that PFOS and PFOA were immune hazards to human health. They have now had that report peer-reviewed by a panel of toxicologists and scientists who had no qualms, no questions about their findings. And what they say in their report is that it's an immune hazard to the point where it may increase all of our susceptibility to disease, to other disease. So, okay, the next comment I get is, well, that's all well and good, but that's the United States, and we know what they're like. What does the rest of the world think? Well, it's pretty easy. We can go to the UN, the POPs Review Committee, which is the technical scientific committee for the Stockholm Convention, and I've just popped a few of their quotes, and for the people up the back, I'll read them. PFOS is likely, as a result of its long-range environmental transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and environmental effects. That was the conclusion when they listed PFOS. For PFOA, where we're halfway through that assessment, they said that PFOA, there was evidence for kidney and testicular cancer, disruption of thyroid function, and endocrine disruption in women, reduced fertility, increase early onset of menopause. They're not American, they are the global. There are hundreds of countries that are part of the Stockholm Convention. The International Agency for Research onto Cancer classifies PFOA as a possible carcinogenic to humans. And the EU classifies PFOA as carcinogenic and toxic to reproduction and requires any product with it to be labelled may damage the unborn child. Next response. Yes, but there's safe levels. And the response to that is, which safe level? Whose safe level? And then we get into the issue of experts. Now, I've just popped a few of them down. I could put up other countries, I could put up Canada and various other, but I'll just stick with the US EPA, which I'm sure you're all aware of, have released those new water guidelines where they reduce the drinking water levels 3 to 5-fold with this combined level of 0.07 micrograms per litre, that is 0.07 parts per billion per litre. So you can imagine how little that is, and they are concerned about that. One of the things that got missed in that not many people looked at, was they also set what's called a reference dose. And it's easy to remember because it's how much chemical per day per kilogram. So you can work out how much is sort of not acceptable, but they don't expect real harm below that. Now they set that at 0.02 micrograms parts per billion per kilogram per day. Now we have, for both PFOS and PFOA, we have a researcher called Professor Philippe Grandjean. I spoke to him yesterday and this morning. He is probably one of the greatest researchers. I won't call him an expert, I will call him a researcher. He's a professor at Harvard School of Public Health, and again, probably one of the most respected scientific members working on this issue. He is concerned that the US EPA levels are too high because of the immunotoxicity issue, and he's arguing that for PFOA at least, drinking water guidelines should be 0.001 microgram per litre. So you can see it's getting lower and lower and lower. So what did NHealth do? Well, NHealth decided to take a 2008 study that Professor Grandjean was involved in 2008, and he has now said, yes, but science moves on, and 8 years later, there is so much more we know. Anyway, NHealth took this level and they accepted a tolerable daily intake, same thing as a reference dose. It's basically what you can tolerate per kilo per day. They set theirs about 7.5 times that of the US. They then went ahead and set then they set the PFOA one, 7.5 times for PFOS. For PFOA, it was 75 times the US. Then they went and set what I would call outrageously high drinking water levels, ones that I certainly would reject. And if you combine those and compare it with the US ones, it's about 78 times the US drinking water standard. Now I know these levels sound so low, but when you're dealing with chemicals that are so persistent, so bioaccumulative, that can affect the way our hormones and our brain and everything works, low levels matter. Germany did a different thing just recently. They didn't work on a daily intake. They said, well, let's look at what's in people's blood and what we think someone can have in their blood, and that would be not safe, but it would be relatively okay. It wouldn't be too bad. And so for PFOA, they set 2 nanograms per milliliter. Again, that's parts per billion. And for PFOS, they set 5. It's not acceptable, but that was as good as they can. Now, the toxicologist working for the Defence Department at the moment told the Fiskville inquiry into the big PFOA, PFOS contamination down there that around 2,000 nanograms per milliliter would be acceptable. Can't quite see it myself. Okay, that's the end of the techo stuff. What I'd like to now just talk, just for a few minutes, is about some of the strategies and some of the actions that I'm suggesting. You're already doing brilliant things, and I'm not here to tell you how to suck eggs. But from John and my experience with other communities, there's just some things that we would like to pass on that may help. And one of the things I just would like to mention is a situation we worked on through the 1990s to 2000. It was a number of residents who were living on top of what were called cattle tick dip sites. All the farmers, you all know, you've got to dip your cattle, or you used to dip your cattle, now you just use the pour-on for cattle tick. But this is in the old days when they used to run them through an old funnel. It was DDT and arsenic, and because in the North Coast it was the tick quarantine area, there was one of these pretty much every mile. So no farmer had to walk his cattle too far to the next dip. So as you can imagine, if you can just see that map up the top there, that's the 1647 spread over that area, the tick quarantine area. Now, of course, some of the residents, they only found out about this in 1990 when John and I were doing some work on pollution mapping. You know, unfortunately, the Department of Agriculture had known probably for the last 15, 20 years, but, you know, we won't hold that against them. Anyway, the residents found they were living on these highly contaminated sites. One woman I remember literally sobbing in front of me. She was a mum with 3 little kids, and she found out that she had, in between the barbecue, the clothesline and the kids' sandpit, she had 8,000 parts per million of DDT. And somebody was trying to tell her that that was perfectly okay. Anyway, we started to work with them. We got the dip site ministerial advisory committee set up. We worked through the process, trying to collate and consolidate the information. And 4 years later, well, you know, we're pretty slow, the New South Wales government offered to buy out 29 of those residents where the homes were directly on top of the dips. That was great. But look at the last buyout. The last buyout happened in 2000. The message I suppose I'm giving here is, please, we all would love our governments to be there, to be looking after us, to be caring for us, to be concerned about our health and the health of our children. But do not be naive. When it comes to contaminated sites, when it comes to liability, and when it comes to paying out compensation, you are not their first concern. Keep that in your mind. A sad thought, I hate, but it's true. So I just popped up a few things. What are we going to be saying? Say if I came back in 5 years and looked at your situation. I put it down to starting in 2003 because that's when our regulator said don't use them. But I've heard today the Department of Defence was aware of some of the contamination from 1999. So what are we going to know? Well, we're going to know that it's affecting thousands of properties. I think we've got 12 of these priority sites already. We've just got the results back of the contamination of the Gold Coast airport, thanks to the Greens and their freedom of information. And I tell you, my jaw has not come off the floor after I saw those results. I was stunned. So we've got airports around the country that may be in a similar situation. We have 12 defence sites. So this issue is going to affect thousands of people and thousands of properties. And we know you're going to face powerful opponents. Like, if you chose one, the Department of Defence was a great opponent to choose. They are powerful. And you've got governments with deep pockets. So I know you're going to be involved in long and exhausting court cases, and I am so pleased to hear that that has been an immediate thing. Get a class action going, because that was one of the things our little dip residents just couldn't do. They really did believe the government would look after them. So anyway, I don't know what I'm going to be saying in 5 years. I hope I'm going to be saying you've had a successful case, you've worked hard, you've got your results, and you've got an equitable solution. To do that, you are going to have to come on board and get your head around some pretty contentious issues. And one of the things that's important to know is that the evidence on these chemicals are rapidly changing. What we may know yesterday may be different today. So things are changing, so you've got to keep up with that. The sort of issues you're going to be faced and the sort of issues that our dip residents faced was the whole issue of risk assessment. You're about to face, I gather, a risk assessment that's going to come out soon. And some of you are going to have to be able to go through that risk assessment, understand what they're saying, why they've chosen those endpoints, why they've chosen that type of risk assessment, because there's numerous different forms of risk assessment, and you're going to have to be able to argue it. Otherwise you will be snowed. You hear a lot about the studies being inconsistent. And one of the things that really frustrates me was when they talk about the inconsistency of cancer studies, particularly for PFOA. Because the POPs Review Committee just recently, in the document we're working on now, has a little statement saying, well, all of these studies have found, yes, PFOA is related to cancer, and we have one study that does not. Now, I could say that this person who did that study probably has leanings towards the industry, but I'll be careful and I won't, do any defamation. But what I'm saying is this idea of inconsistency, you need to be able to challenge that. And if things were inconsistent, even if you had 50% of the studies saying no and 50% of the studies saying yes, what should you do? Well, maybe you'd look at a weight of evidence, or maybe you'd look at a precautionary approach. These are things you need to think about and talk about, and you need to have them clear in your mind before you sit again through another one of these long and tenuous meetings. One of the issues that you need to think about is this association and causation. I remember when the first of the studies were, or the government was having to accept some of the studies last year, and then they said, well, it doesn't mean just because someone gets an impact that's shown to be caused by PFOA in animal tests, that's causation. It's the tobacco argument, I'll put it easier. You smoke tobacco and you get lung cancer. And the tobacco industry for 20 or 30 years argued that the smoking didn't cause the lung cancer, it's just an association. These are the weasel words you need to understand and you need to be able to argue. Then there's other things like, the multiplier effect, which we talked about. The fact that sometimes levels may be low, but the effect may be great because the timing of the exposure. Children and teenagers, believe it or not, have what's called windows of vulnerability. This is WHO, World Health Organization, saying this again, not one. And of course, there's this issue of endocrine disruption or hormone disruption, which means that sometimes, I'll explain this, the monotonic and monomonotonic curves, basically what they just mean is that just because you're exposed to a little bit doesn't mean that the impact will be less than if you're exposed to a lot and the impact high. For children at certain times and with certain chemicals, it's not a linear dose response. But that's perhaps not that important. So here's my last one. I just want to give you a few of the suggested actions and activities that, if I was in your place, I would think about. I know you have got great alliances with the other groups, and I know you're talking about talking with the other groups across Australia. But it would be really good to see a national and very public alliance with the groups across Australia. We already have groups in Oakey, in Fiskville, in Northern Territory, in Darwin, in Adelaide, and in Western Australia. And never before is it so important to have strength in numbers. A national alliance would give you power and would scare the living daylights out of the government. It's important to decide exactly what you want. Do you want buyout? Do you want compensation? Are you interested in getting injury acknowledged or nuisance? Or do you just want information? Or do you want all of the above? You need to be clear in your mind, and as groups, you need to think about the scope of things people want and what you're trying to achieve. Because it's no good if you get into a negotiation situation, talking around but not being sure about where you want to get to. Once you know that, I think it'd be good if you established an Australian-wide strategy committee, I call it, that understands what you want and thinks about different things to help you get there. I hope you start contacting some of the support groups. I know there are groups like Doctors of the Environment who are interested in some of these issues. There are others like academics who would come on board if you approach them. There are community science groups, community health survey groups. There's a whole range of support groups out there that I think you could bring in and that would give you support. You need to cultivate the national and international media. Now certainly I take my hat off to your media coverage in this region and in Sydney. It has been excellent and you have done a fantastic job. We need to see that Australian-wide. We need to see those other groups get that sort of coverage, and then we need international exposure, because international exposure does matter. It can embarrass a government into action. And then there's some immediate tasks, and I go back to my risk assessment. You need a small group to get together and prepare for that risk assessment. You don't want to be called flat-footed when that comes through. I think it'd be really good to see a joint Facebook site so that you had a Facebook site that represented all of the groups as well as your own individual ones. You need somewhere where all of the information is coming together, either on a website or if it's on someone's computer, so that other people can have access, so that you're not all trying to reinvent the wheel or trying to find out information. Because it's amazing, you know, you go along thinking, oh, how am I ever going to find out this? And then you find out that your neighbour next door already has that. So you need to make your efforts as useful as they can be. And I think it's important to talk about who's who in the legals. And as I said, I'm super pleased to see that you've got your class actions going. So, one thing I would say is thank you very much for listening. I want to congratulate you all because truly I think you've done a brilliant job. My last bit of advice is celebrate every little win. Every time you have the tiniest win, celebrate it, because you'll need to. So good luck.